May 19, 1953, St. George, Utah. The morning sky flashes white, brighter than the sun. A shock wave rolls through the desert, rattling windows and hearts. On the horizon, a mushroom cloud rises from the Nevada test site, part of Operation Upshot, Knothole. Families step outside to watch, believing they are witnessing progress. Children laugh as fine dust falls from the sky, catching it on their tongues. No one knows it's radioactive fallout, iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium drifting silently east. Over 100 nuclear tests lit up the desert between 1951 and 1958. The Atomic Energy Commission called them safe, but in the years that followed, the Downwinders began to die cancers, miscarriages, and generations marked by invisible scars. Today, the winds still carry trace radiation across that same desert. The graves are countless, the silence immeasurable. The desert remembers what America tried to forget. But the truth goes deeper. Watch the full story on Ghost of War. May 19, 1953, Nye County, Nevada. At 5:32 a.m., the desert was still a cold hush stretching between the mountains and the endless dust. The sand glittered faintly beneath the half-light, the kind that makes even shadows hold their breath. Then, from the south, came the rumble. Low at first, like distant thunder. In the small town of St. George, Utah, just 135 miles downwind, 11-year-old Nancy Williams was brushing her hair by the window. She saw the horizon pulse once, a blinding bloom of white fire that turned the entire morning to noon. Seconds later, the ground trembled. Dishes rattled in the sink. Her mother shouted from the kitchen, "It's just another test. Honey, they said it's safe." Outside, the children cheered. They had been told these flashes were part of Operation Upshot Knothole nuclear tests conducted by the Atomic Energy Commission at the Nevada test site, codenamed Area 400. Newspapers called it America's progress in the atomic age. Local radio hosts reminded listeners that no harmful effects had been found. And when the shock wave arrived rolling through the streets like a giant's invisible hand, everyone stepped outside to watch the strange, rising cloud. It was beautiful in a terrible way. A white column piercing the heavens, folding itself into a mushroom, glowing orange at the edges. Within hours, that cloud began to drift east straight toward them. By noon, it had changed shape. The children of St. George, still in their schoolyard, watched as a fine, sparkling dust began to fall. They laughed and chased each other through it, holding out their tongues to catch the snow. Teachers, too, stayed outside, marveling at the spectacle. None of them knew they were playing in fallout the radioactive remains of plutonium, iodine-131 and cesium-137. Miles away, at the test site, technicians in white coveralls and respirators were measuring radiation levels. A soldier standing watch at Ground Zero, his name was Corporal Alan Frey, part of the 235th Signal Company, later wrote in his diary, "We watched the cloud rise. Beautiful. Then they told us to keep our Geiger counters on. I saw the needle go wild." He and his men were ordered to remain in the field, taking readings. Some were told to march toward the blast crater after 2 hours to observe terrain effects. Few wore proper protection. Most did not know what REM or Röntgen meant. Back in town, the dust settled on everything on laundry lines, cattle feed, and the water trough behind the Williams barn. The next morning, cows refused to eat. Their hides later began to blister. Local ranchers called it sun poisoning. The county doctor said it was nothing serious, probably the dry air. The tests continued, Between 1951 and 1958, the Nevada test site saw over 100 above-ground detonations. Each one sent radioactive debris across Utah, Arizona, and Nevada carried by the jet stream, invisible and unstoppable. At night, people gathered on porches to watch the horizon light up. The flashes were so bright that, for a moment, you could read a newspaper at midnight. Hotels in Las Vegas advertised atomic view breakfasts. Tourists came to see the spectacle. The nation watched with pride, but in St. George, the sicknesses began. First, the livestock sheep miscarrying by the hundreds, lambs born eyeless or limbless. Then the people, Nancy's father, a postal worker, began coughing blood in 1957. Her best friend, Carol, developed strange burns that never healed. The local hospital, once half empty, became crowded with patients showing symptoms no one could explain. In 1958, a local veterinarian named Dr. Charles Kelly began to suspect radiation poisoning. He wrote letters to state officials and the Atomic Energy Commission, asking whether fallout from the tests could be causing the deaths. He received a single-page reply. No harmful levels of radiation have been detected. Local conditions are safe for human and animal life. He was told to stop spreading unnecessary alarm, and so the town stayed quiet even as more funerals followed. Even as the desert glowed faintly at night, where the dust had settled thickest. By 1960, the silence around St. George had become a kind of second radiation, invisible, persistent, lethal, in slow motion. It moved through whispers at grocery stores, through empty desks at the local school. Nancy Williams was 18 now, working part-time at the county library. Her once vibrant hair had thinned. Her mother said it was the desert air. Her father was gone, stomach cancer. They said he died in less than 6 months. No one in town dared call it by its true name. The official story was still the same. The tests are safe. On the radio, the Atomic Energy Commission broadcast cheerful updates. No measurable hazards to public health have been found. But behind those words were reports the public never saw, internal memos describing contamination zones, fallout trajectories, and hot particles carried hundreds of miles from the Nevada test site. The most infamous of these tests, Shot Harry, had detonated on May 19, 1953, the same day Nancy saw the sky shimmer. Later analyses would reveal it released one of the highest levels of radioactive fallout in continental U.S. history. The plume traveled northeast, directly over St. George, Cedar City, and the Mormon farming communities beyond. In one government field report, declassified decades later, a line read, "Fallout exposure in downwind sectors may exceed recommended tolerance levels by 10x or greater." But in 1960, the people knew nothing. They were too busy living and dying. The Williams neighbor, a man named Frank Dalton, lost 2 sons before they reached 20, leukemia. His wife miscarried 3 times. Across the fence, another family buried a newborn every spring. The local cemetery grew row after row of fresh headstones marked by years that seemed too close together. One morning, Nancy stood at the window again, watching the horizon where the clouds had once bloomed. The air shimmered faintly, as if still holding the ghost of those explosions. She remembered running under that silver dust as a child. She remembered the way it sparkled. She didn't know that her thyroid had already absorbed the radioactive iodine. Across the state line, at the Nevada test site, the detonations continued under the new Plumb Bob series 1957 and hardtack the Secu 1958. Soldiers were still being used as subjects, atomic troops positioned within miles of ground zero to test survivability. In Operation Desert Rock, Young men crouched in trenches as the desert burned around them. The shock waves hit like a hammer, sending fine sand into their mouths and eyes. When the blast faded, they were ordered to stand and march toward the mushroom cloud. Many of them would later develop cancers, sterility, and birth defects in their children. One of those soldiers, Sergeant John Hughes, would later testify before Congress in 1979. They told us we were part of history. We were, just not the kind that anyone wanted to remember. Meanwhile, films and photographs from Hollywood productions began showing eerie coincidences. In 1956, The Conqueror, starring John Wayne, was shot near St. George, less than 150 miles from the test site. By the 1970s, nearly half the cast and crew had developed cancer, including Wayne, director Dick Powell, and actress Susan Hayward. They, too, had breathed the same dust. By 1963, the world was beginning to change. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought nuclear fear to every household. Protests against atmospheric testing grew louder. That year, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed, banning above-ground detonations. But for St. George, it was already too late. The damage was buried deep in bones, in bloodlines, in the soil. Nancy married in 1965. By 1968, she had lost 2 pregnancies. The doctor at Cedar City Hospital mentioned possible genetic issues. She never connected it to the clouds. Each night, when she closed her eyes, she could still see the desert glowing that beautiful, deadly light of her childhood. By the late 1970s, the children who had once played beneath those luminous clouds had grown into adults, and they were dying. Thyroid cancer, leukemia, bone marrow failure, malformed births. Doctors began to notice patterns that statistics could no longer hide. The Downwinders, as they would later be called, were living proof that the fallout never truly settled. Nancy Williams was now 40, her hair almost gone from a second round of chemotherapy. She had moved to Cedar City after her husband's death lung cancer at 43, though he had never smoked. Her small home sat along a dirt road where the dust still rose in golden spirals each evening, catching the last light like tiny suns. Every few months, she would drive to Las Vegas for treatment. The highway to the city ran parallel to the old test site, a vast, fenced wasteland marked by weathered signs, U.S. Government property, no trespassing. From a distance, it looked peaceful. But beyond those fences, craters spread across the desert floor, silent scars of Operation Teapot, Plum Bob, and Ranger. Each hole was a memory of the flash that once turned night to day. In the waiting rooms of Nevada hospitals, Nancy began meeting others like her farmers, teachers, veterans. They spoke in low voices, exchanging stories that sounded eerily alike. One man from Alamo told her, "My sheep started dying before we did." That should have been the warning. The government still denied a link, but the evidence had begun to leak out literally and politically. Declassified test records revealed contamination readings across Utah that had exceeded safe levels by more than 100-fold. Fallout had been tracked as far as the Dakotas, and even New York. The term downwind population appeared in a 1962 AEC memo, later unearthed by investigative journalists. It read, "Though exposure may exceed recommended limits, public acknowledgement could incite unnecessary panic." For Nancy, those words, when she finally read them in a 1979 Los Angeles Times article, were more painful than her diagnosis. Unnecessary panic. As if her father's death, her miscarriages, her friend's tumors were a misunderstanding. That same year, Senator Ted Kennedy introduced hearings on nuclear test compensation. Testimonies poured in thick files of forgotten lives. Among them was one from a St. George school teacher who described ash falling like lace from the sky. Another from a Mormon mother who lost all 3 of her sons before they reached 30. When Nancy was called to testify, she brought a faded Polaroid photo children laughing beneath a sky streaked with white trails. "That's us," she said, voice trembling. "They told us it was safe to play outside." The room fell silent. Her story echoed through the hearing chamber like the desert wind, soft, mournful, unstoppable. It was no longer about one town or one test. It was about a nation that had glowed with pride, while its own citizens glowed in the dark. By the 1980s, the government finally admitted what had long been whispered. In 1982, the Department of Energy acknowledged that certain populations had received excessive exposure. 2 years later, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, began to take shape, offering small sums to the dying and their families. $50,000 for downwinders, $75,000 for uranium miners, paper money for lives erased. Nancy received her letter of approval in 1992. She was too weak to cash the check. Her daughter, born after years of failed pregnancies, found it tucked inside a book after her death, A Farewell to Arms, its pages yellowed with time. On the envelope, Nancy had written in careful script, "For the ones who were told it was safe, outside, the desert still shimmered." Even decades later, Geiger counters would click softly in the wind, measuring what could not be undone. Spring, 1995. The Nevada desert looks peaceful from the highway, a mirage of quiet gold under a pale, endless sky. But if you walk far enough beyond the fence line of the old Nevada test site, past the rusted warning signs and the hollowed-out bunkers, you can still hear the faint ticking of Geiger counters, the hum of what the earth remembers. Nancy Williams was gone by then. So were most of her childhood friends, Carol, Tommy, and the Dalton boys. The cemetery on the edge of St. George had doubled in size since the 1960s. Locals stopped counting how many graves bore the same years: 1953, 1957, 1962. Generations marked by the date the clouds rolled over. Her daughter, Sarah Williams, now 32, returned that spring. She parked her car by the old elementary school, long abandoned. Its windows boarded and roof caved in, and began to walk. The air smelled of dust and sagebrush. The playground was still there, its swings half buried in sand. She could almost hear the echoes of laughter. Her mother's stories of that day. The sky had sparkled like Christmas, but this was no memory of wonder. This was inheritance. Sarah had been 6 when her mother's hair began to fall out, 14 when she learned the word carcinoma, 20 when she buried her. Growing up, she'd watched the desert change, not visibly, but through the names that disappeared from Christmas cards, the empty houses that no one bought. Everyone called it the sickness. By then, the scientific truth was public. The National Cancer Institute's 1997 report estimated that more than 212,000 people had received thyroid doses high enough to increase cancer risk. In some Utah counties, children had been exposed to levels of radioactive iodine up to 200 times above safe limits. But reports were only words, sterile, distant, written in neutral tones. They did not describe the slow terror of waiting for test results, the smell of antiseptic and fear in hospital rooms, the sound of earth striking wood at yet another funeral. Sarah stood in the center of the old schoolyard, watching the sunlight move through the dust. Each grain seemed to shimmer faintly, as if holding a memory of its own. She bent down, ran her fingers through the sand, and whispered not a prayer, not anger, just her mother's name. Far to the south, near Mercury, Nevada. The craters of Operation Plumbob remained silent bowls carved into the desert floor. The government had covered most of them, planted warning markers, and declared the area safe for limited research. But even the wind carried trace elements, still strontium-90, cesium-137, too small to see, too stubborn to forget. In 2001, a historian named Dr. Robert Norris visited the same grounds. His dosimeter registered low but steady readings. The ground hums. He wrote in his field notes, "It hums like memory." He later published a book, The Downwind Legacy, documenting interviews from survivors, the farmers, miners, and widows who still lived near the fallout path. Their words were plain, unadorned. We trusted them. They said it was patriotic. We believed it was light from God. Sarah contributed her mother's letters to the project. In one, dated 1986, Nancy had written, "The hardest part is not dying. It's knowing we were part of something they never intended us to survive." In 2005, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act expired quietly, without ceremony. A handful of politicians called for renewal. It took until 2022 for Congress to revisit it again. By then, many of the original Downwinders were gone. Only their children remained the second wave, born into a silence thicker than fallout itself. And still, in the town that once glowed, the wind keeps moving. It passes over the cemetery, across the rusted playground, through the canyons of Utah. Each gust carries the dust of something once buried and the faint, metallic whisper of what was promised to be safe. Autumn, 2024, St. George, Utah. The desert breathes differently now, quieter, older, yet still restless beneath its skin. The town has grown into a small city with paved roads and glass-front cafes, but the past lingers like static in the air. Beneath the soil, radioactive isotopes still whisper their half-lives: cesium, strontium, iodine, the alphabet of invisible death. Sarah Williams, now in her 60s, walks the same path her mother once did. She carries a recorder in her hand, interviewing the last surviving Downwinders for an oral history project funded by the University of Utah. Many of them are frail, their voices raspy, their hands trembling, but their memories remain vivid, preserved like fossils in grief. "I remember the light," one man says. "You could see your bones through your skin." "I remember the ash," says another. "It was beautiful, like snow." "We didn't know we were dying," Sarah records in silence. She's learned not to interrupt, not to fill the spaces between words. The silence itself is part of the testimony. That evening, she drives to the outskirts of town where the land flattens into pale horizon. The sun sets behind the mesas, painting the desert in bruised oranges and blood reds, the same palette the sky once wore when the bombs rose from the earth. She stops near an old fallout shelter, its metal door half buried in sand, and stands there until the wind picks up. It carries the scent of sage, dry iron, and faint ozone like the echo of lightning. In her bag lies a faded map, the original 1955 AEC fallout pattern chart. She's traced over the isopleths with a pencil, marking every community that lay beneath the drifting plumes: St. George, Cedar City, Parowan, Panguitch. Each name, once just a dot, now represents lives erased. Sarah's project has become her mother's memorial, a map of ghosts. She remembers sitting beside Nancy's hospital bed, holding her hand as her mother whispered, "We didn't even get a warning." It wasn't said with anger, but with disbelief, the kind that sinks deeper than rage. Years later, through declassified archives, Sarah discovered the truth officials had known precisely when and where the fallout would travel. In one memo from May 1953, the day of shot Harry, a meteorologist, wrote, "Wind trajectories suggest civilian exposure may be significant. Recommend delay." The recommendation was ignored. The test went forward at dawn. Every time Sarah reads that line, she feels the air around her tighten, as if the desert itself remembers. In the years since, cancer rates among downwinders have remained higher than national averages. A 2023 epidemiological report by the National Institutes of Health confirmed increased incidences of thyroid, breast, and lung cancer across 10 counties in Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. The contamination, though faded, persists embedded in sediment, in water tables, in bones, yet the story is barely mentioned in school textbooks. Nuclear triumph is still easier to teach than nuclear betrayal as darkness falls. Sarah looks toward the test site, that distant horizon, where the Earth once erupted in artificial dawn. The stars begin to appear, faint and cold. She presses record on her device and begins to speak. This is for the families who were told it was safe, for the children who played in the dust, for the soldiers who marched toward the light. You were not collateral damage. You were the experiment. The wind swallows her words, carrying them east across the same path the fallout once took, through the night. The desert listens, and in that stillness, the ghosts of the downwinders remain not haunting, but waiting to be remembered. Winter, 2025. Snow dusts the red mesas of southern Utah, a rare and quiet mercy. The desert, for once, seems clean, but beneath the surface, the past still glows faintly, invisible yet unyielding. Radiation has no scent, no sound, no color, only memory. Sarah Williams stands inside the modest hall of the St. George Historical Museum, where the exhibition she curated is about to open, The Town That Glowed. Rows of photographs line the walls, children squinting under a sky too bright. Men in uniform posing near mushroom clouds, women hanging laundry dusted with fallout. At the center of the room rests a glass case. Inside it, a small Geiger counter, a faded postcard stamped "Greetings from Atomic City," and a letter her mother wrote in 1985, the one that read, "The hardest part is not dying." The museum lights hum softly. Visitors begin to arrive: journalists, survivors, students. Some carry canes, others carry notebooks. Sarah greets them quietly. She recognizes faces from her recordings, the trembling hands, the familiar half smiles of those who have learned to live alongside grief. On one wall, a projection plays archival footage from the Nevada test site. A blinding flash, the desert rising in waves, soldiers in trenches shielding their eyes. A calm male voice narrating the test proceeds as planned. Atmospheric conditions are favorable, then silence. A young student asks Sarah, "Did they ever apologize?" She hesitates before answering. Not officially. They compensated a few, but an apology would mean admitting they knew. The student nods slowly, and they did. Sarah looks up at the photographs again, the frozen smiles of a nation promised safety. She knows that history, for most, is just a story. For her, it is lineage written in dust and bone. At the far end of the exhibit, a small group gathers around an interactive map, the same one Sarah had traced by hand years before. The screen pulses softly with red circles, marking the path of the fallout. When a visitor taps a dot, a voice plays real recordings of the downwinders she interviewed. "My cows stopped giving milk. We thought it was snow. They told us we were helping our country." Each voice fades into static. Then the next begins. The effect is haunting, a slow chorus of ordinary lives erased by extraordinary deceit. When the exhibition closes that night, Sarah lingers alone in the darkened room. The hum of the Geiger counter still flickers faintly, its clicks spaced out like a heartbeat. She places her palm against the glass, feeling the vibration through her skin. Outside, the desert exhales. Wind drifts over the sand, over the graves, over the empty craters carved by invisible fire. The stars shimmer faintly cold, distant, untouchable. Somewhere beyond those stars, light still travels from the original detonation's photons of that man-made dawn, still racing through the universe 70 years later. A light that outlived its witnesses. Sarah turns off the recorder, closes her notebook, and whispers into the silence. Let the record remain, and in that moment, it feels as though the desert, the same one that once glowed, finally listens. Between 1951 and 1962, 998 nuclear tests were conducted at the Nevada Test Site 100 in the open air. The total yield exceeded 200 Hiroshima bombs. Fallout clouds spread across 48 states, contaminating soil, milk, and water. By conservative estimates, between 340,000 and 690,000 Americans were exposed to significant radiation doses. The U.S. government's own data from the National Cancer Institute 1997 linked up to 212,000 thyroid cancers directly to iodine-131 released during these tests. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, REC, passed in 1990, offered limited restitution, an average of $50,000 per claimant, to those who could prove proximity and illness. Yet for most, justice came too late. Many died before their claims were processed. Even today, isotopes from the Nevada tests linger in the desert's groundwater. Trace amounts of strontium-90 and cesium-137 continue to register in soil samples across Utah and northern Arizona. Though decayed by time, their half-lives 28 years, 30 years, 29,000 years ensure their persistence long after every survivor is gone. In the end, the town that glowed was not a single place, but a constellation of them towns, farms, and homes scattered beneath the wind's invisible hand. Their tragedy lies not in the bombs themselves, but in the silence that followed, a silence so deep it became policy, a silence that let an entire generation vanish into dust. And yet, remembrance persists. In cemeteries, in museum halls, in recordings preserved by those who refuse to forget. For every atom unleashed into the air, there is still one voice left to name it. The desert remembers, and through those who still speak, so do we.